No one wants to knit a sweater only to find that their cuffs cut off the circulation at the wrist, or spend all of that time knitting a sock and discover that you can't actually pull it up over your foot. This video shares 2 of my favourite stretchy cast-on methods to add to your knitting arsenal. Hello and welcome to the Crimson Stitchery, a video channel about making all things beautiful and useful. My name is Anushka and you can find notes and relevant links for this video in the down bar here on YouTube. This is an in-depth video tutorial for 2 of my favourite stretchy cast-on methods. I'll be demonstrating how to work them, what they look like both in the flat and in the round, and on the right sides and the wrong sides. And at the end I'll be doing a comparison between the 2 and talking about the advantages and the disadvantages of both. The first cast-on that I'm going to be demonstrating is one that I really like. It's really simple and straightforward, and in fact it's even the cast-on that I have often taught to beginners when they are learning to knit. It's pretty flexible, and as I said, it's really easy to execute, and the cast-on is the cable cast-on. So the cable cast-on is a knitted on cast-on, which means that you can start with quite a short length of yarn at the beginning, just enough for you to be able to work with and for you to be able to stitch in at the end. And as with, I would say, most cast-ons, it starts with creating a slip knot. So to create a slip knot, just take a short length of yarn. I would say that this is between 6 and 8 inches, which is between 15 and 20 centimeters long, not too long and not too short. And you have the end dangling like so, and then I'm just taking the 2 ends in my hand, twisting it, and then as I make that twist, my fingers are going through the loop and they're catching hold of the length of yarn that is still connected to the ball. And what we result in is a loop that if I pull the length of yarn attached to the ball, it tightens and it's really easy to open up. So that is your slip knot. And so we'll just take that slip knot now, pop the end of the needle through it, and I'm just pulling gently to tighten the slip knot. And so now the slip knot has actually become the first stitch that is sitting on my needle, and we don't need to do anything else with this length of yarn. We can just leave it to one side. Sometimes I just tie a very basic knot in it just to kind of mark it out and make sure that I know that this is not the end that I'm going to be knitting with. But I'll just leave that dangling aside. So now I've got that stitch on the needle. I'm going to create my second stitch very straightforwardly by inserting the needle into the stitch and just doing a basic knitted stitch. And obviously I'm knitting in the right-handed manner or throwing, but if you are knitting in the continental left-handed manner, it's pretty much the same idea. So if I'm going to be making my second stitch in the continental manner, I'm going in, putting the yarn around the needle and knitting the stitch on. Okay, so whatever your method of knitting, the first stitch is a slip knot and the second stitch is a very basic knitted stitch. And now that we've got 2 stitches, we can get onto the actual cable cast on, which is basically very similar to the normal knitted stitch, but instead of knitting a stitch on, which is where you go into the stitch like so, I'm not going to do that, and instead I'm going to insert my working needle in between the 2 stitches like so. So it's actually going in between them, in the space in between, and it's not going into a loop. Just make sure that you don't accidentally catch the back loop of your most recent stitch. So I just go in between, and then I pretty much knit on that stitch, pop it on the next needle and gently tug to tighten it. And now I've got 3 stitches. So you just want to be careful that you're not yanking the working yarn too hard. And that's basically it. So go in between the 2 stitches. You can see it's in between. It's not accidentally catching any loops. And we knit it on. So as you can see, I've got a little trick here, which is after I have pulled the working yarn through and I've popped it onto the needle, before I tug it closed with my working hand, before I pull it tightly closed, I'll actually get my needle in between those stitches, and then I will pull it closed, and then I will proceed to knit through the stitches. So I'm kind of doing 2 in 1 because I'm making sure that my needle has caught the stitch properly and has actually placed for the following one before I pull it closed. And then as you can see, the tail of the yarn that I used for the cast on is just hanging out here. It's not really doing anything much, so later on I would stitch that in. But this is one of the reasons why I enjoy this cast on, especially for a very, very large piece of knitting. If you have to cast on several hundred stitches, such as for a sweater or a shawl, I think it's really good because you don't have to kind of guesstimate how much working yarn you will need. So let me cast on a few more stitches. So you can see that I just opened up that stitch a little bit to get my needle in between, and that is because these needles, these bamboo needles, are pretty blunt. They're not my go-to needle. I generally prefer something with a very sharp tip. But for the purposes of this demonstration, the texture of the bamboo needle is quite apt because it's quite grabby, so the stitches are clinging on and holding on to it quite nicely, which is very nice for doing the demonstration because they're not running away from me. So that's definitely something to consider, especially if speed is of the essence. And I do have a video about how to knit faster where I talk about lots of little tips and tricks you can have for picking up the speed in your knitting if you need it. Now I've cast on 20 stitches, and this is the cast on edge. When you cast on using the cable cast on like so, you're actually casting on and you're looking at the right side of the knitting. And as you can see, it's got a really discreet rolled edge. There's not very much to it, it's pretty slender. And if we look at the wrong side, the reason that you know it's the wrong side, or the so-called wrong side, is because it's just got this little row of bumps, which is the purl stitch. It's like it's got a little scarf wound round the back of its neck. But back to the right side for you to see, and the knit stitches are just sitting there with this very, very unobtrusive kind of twist line at the bottom. If I were to be working a piece of flat knitting and I continued with the knit stitch, this is what it looks like after just one row of knitting. You can see that this curly edge is just a little bit lowered, and the knit stitches, you can just glimpse them sitting there, are just flowing quite nicely in. And if I turn around to the purl side, this row here at the bottom, that was the purl sides that were cast on, and then I've got the next load of purls. So as you can see, it flows really, really nicely in on a piece of flat knitting. So now I have continued to knit flat back and forth, and I've done a few more rows. I've got just over an inch, or about 3 centimeters or so of knitting, and I wanted to show you again what this edge looked like. Now from the knit side, as you can see, it's still very, very discreet. It's just got this nice little rolled edge. And also if I pull it, it doesn't look like it's got tons of stretch, but what it is very, very secure and firm. And it does have about the same flexibility as the rest of the fabric, which is really great. And if I turn it around and show you the purled edge, obviously it's rolling because it's just stocking stitch. You can't even see it from the wrong side, really. You can't really tell that there's anything there. So the reason that this has worked out so nicely is because when I cast on onto the right side, and then when I began to knit flat, I just started again with the right side. So I kept it on the same side as the fabric was when I cast it on. I didn't turn it or do anything different. And so obviously that's what's happening when we're knitting flat. However, obviously if we're knitting in the round, it's going to be slightly different. So I've just done a second cast on here. So what I'm going to do now is divide it among 3 needles for knitting in the round. So that's the first needle. And I'm knitting in the round on double pointed needles, as you can see, but the same principles would apply if you were doing magic loop. So here I've got my cast on edge with the tail of the yarn. And now I'm going to begin knitting in the round. As you can see, I've got my working yarn at the top here. I'm now making sure that the stitches are all sitting on the same direction on the needle, that none of them are twisted. And basically what I'm going to be doing is joining up this end with this end by knitting a stitch and joining up the gap. However, when I join for working in the round, I need to turn my knitting round so that the working yarn is now to the right. And this is the case even if you are knitting in a continental manner, if you are throwing. So because I have turned it round, now what I'm looking at is actually the wrong side of the cast on, because the purl bumps are now what's facing up. And if I get rid of that scrap yarn just by moving it down, this is where tying a little knot can be quite handy. And again, just always double and triple checking that my stitches are not twisted. Now I'm just laying them next to each other, taking my yarn to the back because I'm starting with a knit, and I'm just carefully knitting across the first needle in order to join it in the round. And I've knit across the first needle now. So that's joined it in the round now that they're all connected. And as you can see, those little purl bumps are now sitting on the right side, which basically means that I've got an extra little ridge on the top. Now that may or may not bother you. Sometimes it's quite nice to have an extra little line of purls. And obviously it's quite obvious for stocking stitch because it's almost like there's a little line of garter stitch at the beginning before you get into the stocking stitch. But it actually means that when it comes to something like a rib, especially a 1x1 rib, those purl stitches actually blend in really, really nicely. So that's just the main difference that I wanted to point out, which is that when you're using the cable cast on, you cast on onto the knit side. So when you do flat knitting, like the first one that I showed you, you can keep things on the right side very easily and control which side of the cast on you want to be the right side. However, when you're knitting in the round, because you have to turn the work in order to join it, you then effectively begin knitting on the wrong side of the cast on. The second stretchy cast on method that I'm going to be demonstrating is one that I also really enjoy doing, and it produces quite a different effect. It's the Old Norwegian cast on, also known, I believe, as the German twisted cast on. So the reason that the Old Norwegian cast on is so different is because it's a variation on the long tail cast on, which means that you need to start with a long length of yarn. How long obviously depends on the number of stitches you'll be casting on. A good estimate is about 3 times the width of your expected cast on. And when it comes to sock knitting, what I generally do is I just pull out about an arm's length of thread and then make my slip knot there. But for the purposes of this tutorial, we'll start a little bit shorter. And again, I'm going to start by making my slip knot, and then I'll just pop that slip knot onto the needle and tighten it. So now we're going to be working the cast on using the tail of the yarn, one end at the bottom, and the working yarn that's attached to the ball on the top, as it were. So what you need to do is kind of form this number 7 or gunslinger kind of shape with your hand. I'd like to find a non-violent way of describing this shape. And what you do is you take the thumb and the forefinger and you go in between the 2 lengths of yarn like that, so they're now dangling over both fingers. And then I grab the 2 lengths of yarn with the rest of my hand. So if I just demonstrate that in a flow, I've got the yarn attached to the ball at the top and the tail at the bottom. I'm going in, grabbing them, and then I've got this, let's just call it upside down number 7 inside, and the rest of my fingers are grabbing onto the 2 lengths of yarn. Then I bring it down, go under the 2 loops of the thumb and in, go up and pick up the one, and through and off, under, in, pick up the one on the forefinger, put it in between, take it off and pull it tight. So hopefully you'll have got a sense of that by now. I'll just talk it through one more time. So I've gone in with my 2 fingers, and then the rest of my fingers hold the 2 lengths of yarn fairly firmly. Then I go down to create a loop, under and in, pick up that one and pull it through. So this one is quite nice once you get the muscle memory of it. Really easy to get into a rhythm and a flow, which makes it really nice to do when you've got loads of stitches to cast on. But obviously you've got to make sure, as I said, that you've got enough of the tail, the working yarn. And it's very similar to the basic long tail cast on, but you're basically adding in an extra twist. So you're making a twist with the loop around the thumb, then pulling the one from the forefinger through it. One last tip is just to make sure that when you pull the stitch through, just don't yank on it too hard, because you don't want to choke it. It's just going to make things harder later on. You know, just not too tight and not too loose. And there we have it. I think that this Old Norwegian cast on can be a little bit sensitive to changes in tension. You can see it's gone a little bit lumpy as I've been talking to the camera and sort of overthinking what I'm demonstrating. I think the most noticeable thing is that you cast on and you're working in the opposite direction, because the working yarn is here and not here, and you've got a lot of these extra wraps around the stitches. You can see that kind of pearl jacket there. And if I turn it round, how we'd use this cast on if we were knitting flat, so that the working yarn's at the top again, on the right, again we've got another little row of scarves round the necks of the stitches, and that's because of the extra wraps that we were doing. So it's pretty thick, and that means that it can be a very, very sturdy cast on. And now I've just knit one row, and you can see that again there's quite a pronounced purl row at the beginning from all of those twists, and again it kind of looks a little bit like garter stitch. And if I turn it round to the wrong side, so hopefully you can see that that is the end of the purl stitch right at the top of the needle, and then I've got this double row of what look like wrong side purl stitches, which has again come from the extra loops that I was taking when I was wrapping all of the stitches in this cast on. So now I've done a little bit more knitting to show you what the cast on edge looks like in context. And as I think it's quite obvious, when it comes to the stocking stitch, you can really clearly see that line of twists, which is having a kind of purl appearance. And also that the edge is just pretty chunky in general. And if I turn it to the wrong side, it just disappears in to the purl. And because there's that appearance of the purl on both sides, when it comes to joining the Old Norwegian cast on stitches in the round, there's actually much less of a difference as there was when it comes to the cable cast on. So here I've gone ahead and divided up my cast on stitches across 3 needles. And again, making sure that I'm not going to be knitting with the tail, but actually with the end that's attached to the ball. So I'll just make sure that my stitches are not twisted, that they're all hanging down in the same direction. And now taking the working yarn, I'll just begin to knit down the first line of stitches. And that's it there. So on the right side, again, a little purl twist. And on the wrong side, after just one line of knitting, it actually looks like a lot of knitting on the purl side. And again, that's because this was a chunkier cast on with all of those extra twists that we were doing around our L-shaped yarn grip. So on these 2 cast on samples, I've demonstrated to you what the right side and the wrong side stitches look like. And obviously you may be using this stretchy cast on to cast on a number of different stitches, not just stocking stitch, but I hope that this gives you a little bit of versatility in imagining whether you're casting on with a garter stitch edge, or perhaps with a rib, or something completely different, some kind of inventive stitch pattern, or maybe you're casting on an edge that will need stitches picked up on, and hopefully it will give you a sense of how the cast on looks. And lastly, I thought I'd just show you a couple of pairs of socks that I've knitted using these cast on. So firstly, the cable cast on, I've got this pair of festive looking socks, and as you can see, this sock ribbing is done in a 2x2 rib, basic 2x2 rib. If I stretch it out, it stretches out and pings back in quite a nice way. There's no problem there. And the actual ribbed edge itself is pretty discreet. So even though this knit stitch of the rib did come out with a wrong side purl at the top, as we discussed earlier, it's actually pretty discreet. You don't really notice it at all. and the pearl stitches just blend in really nicely. The edge is quite thin. And that's it from the top. If I stretch it again, it's okay, has a nice stretch. And even though this obviously looks quite small, I have no problem getting this over my rather shapely cyclist's calves. So then now if we go back to the Old Norwegian cast on, I've got these socks, which are my own pattern, the Twister Lolly socks. This cuff is knit in a 1x2 twisted rib, so there are 2 pearl stitches in between the twisted knit stitch. So fairly different from the 2x2 basic rib. And I think you can see straight away that the very top of the cuff with the cast on, there's quite a lot going on. It's thicker, it's a little bit fuller, it's chunkier. You can get a sense that we can definitely see that there's a kind of rolled, almost garter stitch like cast on edge at the top. So it's not as discreet. And the inside is the same. It's chunkier, it doesn't blend in as well. I think even on the pearl stitch it kind of rolls in a little bit more, but you can definitely sense that there's an edging. And if we think about the stretch, it does actually feel slightly stretchier than the cable cast on, and it feels quite strong when I stretch it. And again, that's because of all of those extra twists, which are what are adding this kind of slightly chunkier edging to my cuff. And if I bring them now both next to each other, I think they've got a similar number of stitches cast on, and I stretch them both out. I'm not sure how much you can see, but this Old Norwegian one at the bottom, it is stretching a little bit more than the cable cast on, but to be honest with you, the cable cast on is still pretty sturdy. So I would say that the advantages of the cable cast on that we worked are that it's very discreet, it's very simple and straightforward, easy to work, and that you can work it with a very little amount of tail of scrap yarn, because you're casting on with actually the working yarn that's attached to the balls. So it can be great for situations when you've got a lot of stitches to cast on, or that you just kind of don't want to get tangled up in the yarn in the same way as the Old Norwegian cast on. And the advantages of the Old Norwegian cast on are that when you get into a flow of it, it's actually extremely fast, and that the knitted on edge is pretty sturdy. And the disadvantages being that obviously you have to manage that very, very long tail in order to cast it on, and you have to be aware of the length that you have got going, and you know, just kind of not get tangled up. And the other disadvantage is that it is a little bit chunkier and slightly less discreet. But to be honest with you, when it comes to a pair of socks, at the end of the day, I think that these are pretty minute differences. So I do tend to go between these 2 different cast-ons according to my mood and just what I feel like doing in the moment.
It's always great to pick up new skills in knitting, and I hope that you've enjoyed watching this video and that perhaps you might have learned something new. Do let me know in the comments if you've tried out any of these methods already and how you've got on with them, or if you have any other tips about making a really fabulous, flexible, stretchy cast on, or if there are any other straightforward methods that you enjoy practicing in your knitting projects as well. If you've enjoyed this video, do hit the thumbs up button and subscribe down below for weekly videos about knitting and crochet, sewing, mending, and everything that I've been making that's beautiful and useful. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.